Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to another episode. Again, trying not to sound so like DJ or some sort. Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show with me, Edwin Sarmiento, being your host. And the goal of these knowledge sharing, I want to consider them as knowledge sharing sessions, is for me to share some of my experiences and those of my customers working with high availability solutions that are specifically designed for SQL Server, share them with you and make them practical, because high availability and disaster recovery solutions are already complicated. They're complex, they're confusing, they're convoluted. My goal is to make them practical so you can immediately take action on them, right? And you've heard me a lot of times say that high availability and disaster recovery is not a one-man sport. You have to deal with people with different technical expertise, with teams that have different roles and responsibilities. And this is really what it is when it comes to high availability and disaster recovery solutions. Now, whether you're a SQL Server DBA responsible for taking care of SQL Server and making it highly available, or you're a sysadmin and it just so happens that you're one of the members within a team that was just given the responsibility to take care of SQL Server, or maybe you're the developer who happen to know a thing or two about SQL, and then now you're given the responsibility. Again, the goal is to make high availability and disaster recovery solutions practical. The topics that I come up with in these episodes are, again, based on my interactions with my customers, from my own experience as well, what I've seen in the field. Because here's the thing, though, even when you look at the documentation from Microsoft or other third-party vendors, sometimes they're limited to what is available within what they can provide, meaning what they've tested, what they've documented, what they consider to be supported. Of course, I don't recommend you going outside of whatever it is that either Microsoft or a third-party vendor would consider to be supported. I mean, sure, you can make it work, but if it's not officially supported, then you're on your own. Let's get down to today's topic, or this week's topic. It's all about dealing with external dependencies the right way. High availability and disaster recovery solutions, particularly when you're focused more on the SQL Server data platform, requires interacting with other external dependencies that have nothing to do with SQL Server. I'll use always on availability groups as an example. When you think about it, initially, just thinking about SQL Server in itself, this depends on a lot of different things. Again, let's confine our conversation first with just SQL Server, the SQL Server instance in of itself. Let's just remove high availability for now. SQL Server in itself is already dependent on so many different things that are outside of SQL Server, which may be outside of your scope of responsibility. Take, for instance, your databases sit on a storage device, whether that's a local attached storage, a network attached storage, a storage area network, anything, or hyperconverged storage. Your SQL Server databases sit on a storage subsystem. Take that out of the equation, SQL Server doesn't work, right? SQL Server also depends on the hardware infrastructure in and of itself. Remove the hardware, no SQL Server, right? SQL Server also relies on the operating system. No operating system, no SQL Server. And these are the things, I'm just pointing out the obvious here. SQL Server depends so much on things that are outside. I'm the storage team, right? There may be a dedicated team taking care of the hardware, the hardware team, right? Or there may be a dedicated team taking care of the operating system, like the Windows team or the sysadmin team. And again, we're not even looking at high availability in this case. So now let's put in stuff like always on availability groups. Now, your SQL Server always on availability groups sit on top of a failover cluster. You remove the Windows Server Failover Cluster, always on availability group is not highly available, right? Although the Microsoft documentation can talk about clusterless availability groups. Let's not even get there because that's not highly available. But again, always on availability groups sit on top of a Windows Server Failover Cluster, which is managed by probably a different team, probably a Windows team or the infrastructure team. Creating a failover cluster depends on Active Directory and DNS. That listener name that you're creating when you're building your availability group, that depends on Active Directory and DNS. The communication between your primary and your secondary replica depends on the network. So now that we are flushing out some of these things that pertain to high availability, you start to see how SQL Server depends so much on all of these external dependencies. In fact, when DBAs are confronted with challenges like, hey, I cannot create a listener name, I just told them the fact. Your job is now dependent on the things that you're not even aware that your job is dependent on. Now, I couldn't count the number of times when a DBA is surprised because their availability groups, the reliability and the availability of their databases are now very much dependent on the things that are outside of their control. This reminded me of a client I worked with in the early 2013, 2014. This was in the early days of always on availability groups. And they came to me and they told me, hey, we have been getting these issues every single day and we don't know where to start. And I asked them, tell me a story and tell me what the issue is. Every 8 p.m., and they're very specific, every 8 p.m., their entire application stack, which depends on an always on available group, goes offline. Their entire application stack, from the front end to the middle tier to the database, their entire application stack goes offline at exactly 8 p.m. and it would come back after like 10, 15 minutes. Of course, I'm knowing, what could probably cause that, but I'm really curious. So what's going on? What else is happening? What patterns do you see? And they recognized that, again, 8 p.m. is the time when they're, virtual not virtual admins. Sometimes when we talk about virtual admins, we talk about people who don't exist. No, VM admins. Let's talk about VM admins, not virtual people. Their VM admins perform the regular maintenance, which is taking a snapshot of all of the VMs in their hypervisor host and use that as their kind of like a daily backup, right? That in itself just gave me an idea of what exactly is causing the problem, right? They're always on available groups are sitting on VMs, virtual machines, and the snapshot the VM admins are taking is causing the connectivity and communication between the failover cluster nodes to cause loss of quorum, which takes down the entire failover cluster, which takes down SQL Server always on availability group, because the databases that are connected to this also takes down their middle tier, their front end, and therefore the blip in their application. And it only takes like 15 minutes, right? And that's the challenge of this is when your database you have no full control, then your hands are tied, you don't know what to do. And you might be in a situation like this where somebody else is doing something, you're not aware of them, and all of a sudden you get a page through, you have no idea what is going on. You have no clue how to deal with, and worst of all, you don't have any permissions at all to even deal with it, right? So I want to talk about this, and I'm setting the stage right because, again, your high availability solutions are dependent on something else. Even if your job responsibility is to fully focus on the SQL Server databases, the fact that you have implemented a high availability solution now is affected and influenced by things outside of SQL Server, and now you have to be dependent on them, right? And that's why I talked about this. And um, I want to start with the assumption, because I talked about so many different things already. Your Active Directory people, DNS guys, networking guys, storage, uh, sysadmins, operating system admins, uh, and you, DBA. All of these external dependencies are managed by human beings, right? By people like us. So again, for those of you who are thinking, oh, AI is going to replace the things that we do and the work that we do, and then we're going to get outsourced. We're still humans. We're the ones making the technology. We're the ones running the technology. So unless you give power to what you think will take over you, then they will. But otherwise, you're still going to be responsible for making all of these work. Just throwing it out there. Take your pen and paper. I didn't realize that this mixed with white becomes invisible. Anyway, grab your pen and paper, take notes. Um, these are 3 things that you can do to deal with these external dependencies the right way, right? Again, starting with the assumption that all of these external dependencies are handled, managed, and taken care of by people like us, human beings, right? And I use the acronym UCS, again, just giving you some heads up over there. I use this acronym UCS as a strategy to deal with these external dependencies. The first thing, the U, stands with understand, right? Like I said, you are going to be dealing with people. You need to understand what they do, right? Going back to that incident I worked on, the customers I work with, they didn't understand that there were other teams that need to do what they need to do in order to fulfill the business requirement. Meaning, well, the VM admins, they needed to do their daily snapshots in order for them to have what is considered to be a valid working backup as far as the VMs are concerned, right? They're doing something in order for them to achieve a business requirement, to accomplish a task and achieve a goal. Sometimes in siloed environments where you have segregation of duties, you're so fixated on what you're currently working on that you're not aware of what the other teams are actually doing, right? So start with understanding what those people do, what those teams do. It could be, a one-man team. I've seen cases where there's one-man teams. God bless their soul. How do they handle on call? Anyway, you understand what they do. Ask them, take them for lunch, get them something to drink, buy them coffee, their favorite beverage. Although it's kind of hard to do that when you're working from home. But be curious, understand what they do. A simple example is this. Going back to that incident that I worked with, um, ask the VM admins. If you're a DBA, if you're the sysadmin, you got to know exactly what's going on, right? But if you're the DBA and you're responsible for your always on available group, you're responsible for the databases, and then you understand that your SQL Server instance is actually running on VMs. Go talk to your VM admins. Ask questions. Be curious, right? The goal is not for you to take over their jobs. Okay, you got to set the expectation. Hey, I'm trying to understand what you're doing. I don't want your job. Go do it, right? Unless, of course, you do. Understand what they do. What does their day-to-day look like? Ask questions. Again, be curious. If they're VM admins, ask, how do you provision your VMs? How does our VM infrastructure look like? What else is running on the VM host that my always on available group VMs are running on? Uh, is that dedicated to always on available or SQL Server VMs, or are there something else? Because a lot of these things will uncover things that would definitely impact the way you work with SQL Server. Like for instance, noisy neighbor on a VM host. Well, you spent hours and hours and even days and weeks, sometimes months, trying to troubleshoot a performance problem, not realizing it's a noisy neighbor problem. But you don't know that. because you don't have visibility over your VM host. And that's why just understand what um, what their day-to-day looks like. What do they do? How do they do it? And sometimes the question of why do you do it like that gives you some insights as to why they do it, how they do it, and what they do, right? For instance, like I said, when they're deploying VMs, and we're not even talking about SQL Server here, we're talking about VMs in general. Why? Because you want to understand what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. So, for instance, provisioning a new VM, again, whether it's on premises, on cloud, you can ask, hey, do you provide a golden image as a starting point for every deployment? Or do you just install everything from the ground up, starting from the operating system? How do you go about provisioning VMs? Where do you store these VMs? Are you using pass-through disks? Are you using VMDKs or VHDX? How are you dealing with these? Because again, it will give you some insights as to how they provision your SQL Server VMs, right? Understand what are they doing? How are they doing this? For instance, you can talk to your always on, your not always on, your Active Directory guys. Ask them, hey, how do you provision computer accounts? Um, what's your day to day look like? Um, how how do you manage user requests for password resets? Stuff like this might not have anything to do with you as a DBA managing SQL Server always on availability group. May not have anything to do with, of course, if you're a sysadmin, it has a lot to do. But knowing that gives you some insights as to what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. From in the case of an Active Directory guy, your availability group listener name gets created as a computer object, a cluster name object in Active Directory. And so if you end up not being able to create your always on available group listener name using the wizard or using T-SQL, well, it probably could be a permission issue with Active Directory. So ask them, what are your challenges? How does your day-to-day look like? And again, just to give some context on how they do, what they do, and why they do it, right? Because again, a lot of times because there's inconsistencies with understanding and communicating, it becomes challenging from the point of view of high availability and even disaster recovery to work things out in a way that would benefit everybody. So that's you. Understand, not you, but the letter U. Understand what they do. What does the VM admin do if you're running on VMs? If you're running on physical machines, you can ask your hardware guys, what do they do? How do they set up the server? Because again, you might uncover a configuration setting that isn't ideal for SQL Server, right? C, and again, this is the second item. C stands for care. You might be wondering, what is this all about? We're talking about SQL Server and high availability and dealing with external dependence. Why do I care about caring? Well, for one, again, going back to the assumption that these technology stacks, these external dependencies are managed by people who want to feel that they're being understood, right? So care about what they do. Because, like I said in the beginning, your always on availability groups or your high availability solutions or your disaster recovery solutions are dependent on things that these other people are doing. So you have to care about what they do, about how they do it, and why they do it. Here's an example. Network administrators, one of their biggest frustrations is when somebody would request for a firewall rule because of a compliance requirement, a security requirement. So they would come up with a firewall rule that would meet those security and compliance requirements. Now, keep in mind, your availability groups talk to other replicas, and it requires a network. It requires the network. Your primary replica needs to talk to the secondary replica. They have to communicate with each other. And you need to make sure that, of course, whatever firewall rule that they're rolling out does not affect your uh, replication strategy. So you could ask them, hey, uh, What's the last situation? What's the last incident that you have to deal with? Just ask. Ask for what concerns them the most. And I just gave you that very simple example because it's the most common, right? Network admins were told to deploy a firewall rule. They were not told that, in this case, availability groups leverage port 5022 for inter replica traffic. It leverages 1433, not just for the host's IP address, but also for the virtual IP address of the listener name. They roll out the firewall rule. They were not informed about this, and all of a sudden, your secondary replica is down, or the synchronized databases are no longer synchronized. They're synchronizing because there's a firewall that was blocked, or a port that was blocked in the firewall. And all of these things, understanding what is causing a lot of issues for these people. And again, because of the fact that your high availability solutions rely so much on these external dependencies, care about what they do. Think about how you can make their lives easy. Now, again, not taking their responsibilities, not taking over their jobs, because again, in companies where you have segregation of duties, you don't have permissions to access. Well, not to mention, have you ever worked with the Cisco operating system and a command console? Uh, Depends. But again, it is caring about what it is that they're struggling with, what their challenges are, what their frustrations are. And I heard this quote from, I think, one of the leadership experts out there, who said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And just caring about what they do, right? And now that you understand one of their challenges, you can always tell them, hey, do you mind letting me know whenever you're asked to deploy a new firewall rule to meet a compliance requirement, because we can coordinate as to asking for exemptions for port 5022 on both hosts. If you have a 2 replica AG, requesting for exemptions for port 1433 for the IP address of the listener name. And this is showing that you really care, because you don't want him to be blamed for something that he was not even aware of, right? Again, typical example, application connects to the listener name, but because the firewall rule got rolled out and then the port 1433 was blocked, therefore your application can no longer connect to the database. The application guy or the application people start screaming, well, the users start screaming, not knowing it's a firewall rule that got rolled out, which was an instruction from the security people, right? The compliance people. And again, thinking of ways on how you can make life easy for these people, right? We all have our plates full, working with so many issues, incidents, and challenges all at the same time. We can find ways on how we can help make their lives easy. And again, no big deal. It's just it's a simple communication between you, the DBA, and that person who's responsible for deploying a firewall rule in the network, right? You can do the same thing with storage. You can do the same thing with VM. I mean, you could talk to your VM admins and say, hey, um, my my virtual machines, the ones that are running SQL Server, they cannot be on the same virtual host at the same time. So uh, I would appreciate if you could create a policy to prevent them from being on the same physical host at the same time, right? Because again, it defeats the purpose of care. And again, if the VM admin is not aware of how available groups work, they'll just do whatever it is that they've done in the past, not realizing, oops, we rebooted this. Like the example that I gave earlier, we took a snapshot of all the VMs, not realizing it's going to take out the entire application farm, right? Care about what they do and look for ways on how you can help them, right? So that's the letter C. U is for understand what they do. And of course, the challenge there is also taking taking into account that there could be more than one person doing this. The challenge there is you have an entire team doing this, so now you have to communicate, right? And care. That's probably the second thing, the second C there. You have to care and communicate to the entire team, right? Not just one person, okay? Which goes back to the letter U that I mentioned. Understand, take them out for lunch, buy them coffee, just listen and ask questions. S stands for share your knowledge, right? Share your knowledge. More often than not, we jump into sharing first, right? We do it in reverse. We start telling people what to do. Hey, you do this, you do that, and the first instinct is, oh, wait a second, you're giving me additional responsibilities that's supposed to be yours, right? But when you start with understanding what they do, how they do it, and why they do it, you're giving you're giving them the chance to be heard, right? You're giving them the chance to feel that they're cared for, and now you can open up and start sharing with them all of these things, right? Like SQL Server depends on the failover cluster, and so you start to communicate with the sysadmins on how SQL Server is affected in case they decide, hey, we're going to patch the secondary replica node. We are going to reboot the entire Active Directory domain controllers, all of them, right? And this is where you start sharing, the information that you know about the impacts of what they're doing to SQL Server, to the databases in the availability group. An example of this, again, you can talk to your Active Directory guys and tell them, look, I'm happy that you share all of these with me, and I would also appreciate if you have a request for maintenance. For instance, you want to install patches on your Active Directory domain controllers. I would appreciate if you would not reboot all of the domain controllers at the same time. Don't ask me how I know, learn it the hard way. If you can put it in your maintenance window to, probably reboot the machine, a couple of hours later when, one is already done, maybe you reboot the first domain controller, wait for like 10, 15 minutes, and then reboot the second one, wait for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then reboot the third one, just so we're sure that the databases are not affected and the applications are not affected. Because again, when you reboot all the domain controllers at the same time, well, who authenticates your listener name? Nobody, right? Because there are no domain controllers. And your listener name is also a computer name object in Active Directory, which requires authentication. So you have to be aware of all of these interactions. But this is an opportunity for you to start sharing with them the impacts, right? In the same way that you're sharing with the network guy, hey, if you're rolling out a new firewall rule, please do let me know, and I'll help you write an exemption for those port numbers, whatever port number you're using for the data replication traffic for your availability group replicas, and of course, standard 1433 for your listener name. And for your VM admins, you can ask them, hey, I would appreciate if you could let me know if you decide to take snapshots of the VMs. That way we can work on how you can do your patching, how you can do your maintenance, while at the same time us preventing what could be an outage, especially if it's 24/7 system. These are steps that you can take that that would make it easy for you to start coordinating with different teams so that you can deal with these external dependencies the right way, right? The bigger challenge there really is before you can, well, again, just summarizing all that, understand what these people do, what these teams do, care about them, care about what they do, right? Care about their challenges, care about what their struggles are day to day, and how you can make their lives easy from the SQL Server point of view, right? Because again, other people, other teams have a lot of demands from these teams. Just make it easy for them from the point of view of SQL Server high availability, right? And third, and of course, I threw in there to communicate because you're communicating with them. And then S is for sharing the knowledge, right? That's the third one. Sharing knowledge, letting them know that what they're doing impacts SQL Server high availability, what their actions are could affect the application that connects to the databases. And so there's an entire stack that would be, uh, offline if they just did what they did without considering all of these things. And that is kind of like dealing with these external dependencies right way. Because again, even if you know how to deal with it, if you don't have permissions, right? For instance, if you do know how to deal with the firewall rule, like removing the blocks from um, port 50, even if you do know how to do that, given the firewall skills that you have, well, if you don't have the permissions, then you can't. Even if you can work on the VM side of things, if you don't have the permissions, you still can't, right? So dealing with these the right way would help you avoid those outages that could be caused by something outside of SQL Server, right? But the gist of it is this: you will not be able to share what those dependencies are if you're not even aware of them. I was responding to an email a couple of days ago about somebody spinning up a failover cluster so that they could deploy an always-on available groups, but they're not sure of how to configure it, what to configure, what are the external dependencies are even, right? What other things impact the availability of their databases. And if that's, if that's where you're at, and you're now responsible for something as critical as a high availability solution like always on availability groups, well, let's connect. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. We'll look at the gaps in your understanding of what these external dependencies are, right? And let's work on how to close that gap so that you can start communicating these with other teams that are responsible for managing these external dependencies. Because again, your job now is dependent on the things that you're not even aware are dependent on. Last thing you want is for you to get blamed for something that you have no control over and you have no skills whatsoever dealing with it, right? Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that talk. Pick a time that works for you. This would lead you to my calendar page. Pick a time that works for you, and let's have that conversation. I'll provide as much guidance as I possibly can, and if not, I'll steer you in a direction that would help serve you best. All right. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week for another topic of conversation. And hopefully, you're not going to be busy this week with all the maintenance, with all the patching, with all the things that you have to deal with. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.